It did not begin with a scream, but with a song. In the hazy, golden late summer of 1914, the railway stations of Europe were not places of mourning, but cathedrals of jubilation. The air vibrated with the confident thunder of steam engines and the rhythmic clatter of leather boots on cobblestones. Millions of young men, the flower of a generation, boarded the trains with smiles that seemed immortal. They were marching toward what they believed was a glorious adventure, a swift and honorable conflict that would be settled by Christmas. They carried with them the romantic dreams of the 19th century, visions of dashing cavalry charges, colorful uniforms, and medals won in open fields of honor. They were tragically, catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, the music stopped. The old world committed suicide, birthed violently into the mechanized slaughterhouse of the 20th century. The glory they sought was instantly vaporized by the cold industrial reality of modern warfare. What followed was not a parade, but a descent into a hell so profound that it would scar the face of the earth and the soul of humanity forever. As the initial war of movement ground to a bloody halt in northern France, a terrifying realization dawned on the commanders. There was nowhere left to run. The open fields became death traps. To survive the lethal storm of lead and steel, the armies did the only thing they could. They burrowed into the earth. A jagged, festering wound was carved across the continent. This was the Western Front. It was a meandering 450-mile scar of mud, timber, and barbed wire, stretching from the neutral peaks of the Swiss Alps all the way to the frigid gray waves of the North Sea. Here the war of maneuver died, and the war of attrition was born. For 4 agonizing years, this line would barely move. It became a static kingdom of death, where millions of men lived in subterranean squalor, separated from their enemies by a few hundred yards of churned, poison-soaked earth known as no man's land. The generals, baffled by this stalemate, replaced strategy with a gruesome form of mathematics. The German High Command, realizing that a swift victory in France was impossible, adopted a chilling new doctrine. Their goal was no longer to take territory, but to kill. They sought to bleed France white, to inflict such catastrophic casualties that the enemy's will to fight would simply collapse under the weight of the dead. But the Allies, too, were caught in this logic of the butcher's yard. They threw wave after wave of human bodies against positions fortified with the most efficient killing machines ever invented. The result was not victory, but a stalemate written in blood. The land itself became a casualty. As the photographs from this era reveal, the verdant fields of Flanders and the forests of the Argonne were transformed into desolate moonscapes. It was a world stripped of color and life. Ancient trees were reduced to splintered toothpicks, villages were pulverized into red dust, and magnificent cathedrals, like the one in Reims, crumbled under the relentless hammer of incendiary bombs. The artillery was the god of this war. Before the great offensives, the horizon would light up with the flashes of thousands of guns, a man-made thunderstorm that could last for days. At the Battle of the Somme, over 1 million shells were fired in a single week. This drum fire did not just destroy trenches. It reshaped the geology of the region, creating a labyrinth of water-filled craters where wounded men would often drown in the mud, unable to crawl out. This was the first conflict where the technology of the Industrial Revolution was fully harnessed for the purpose of extermination. The machine gun, the scythe of the battlefield, turned open ground into a suicide zone. A single crew with a machining Gewehr 08 could wipe out a battalion in minutes, their water-cooled barrels hissing as they spat 500 rounds every 60 seconds. But the horrors were not limited to lead and steel. Science itself was perverted to create new nightmares. The air turned treacherous as clouds of chlorine and mustard gas drifted silently across the lines. It was a psychological terror unlike any other, forcing men to don rubber masks that robbed them of their humanity, turning them into bug-eyed alien creatures stumbling through a yellow, suffocating fog. And then came the monsters of iron. In 1916, the British unleashed the tank, lumbering, diamond-shaped fortresses designed to crush the barbed wire and cross the trenches. Though clumsy and prone to breakdown, they signaled the end of the old ways of war, terrified mechanical beasts crawling over the broken earth. Yet amidst this industrial cacophony, it is the human experience that remains most haunting. The soldiers lived in conditions that defy modern comprehension. They existed knee-deep in freezing slime, surrounded by the stench of rotting flesh and unwashed bodies. They shared their dugouts with plagues of rats that grew fat on the corpses of the fallen. It was a life of paralyzing boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer, unadulterated terror. They wrote letters home, trying to shield their families from the truth, scribbling words of love while artillery shells screamed overhead. The scale of the loss was staggering. At the Battle of Verdun, the longest engagement of the war, nearly 1 million men became casualties in a battle that changed nothing. At the Somme, on that fateful 1st of July, 1916, 60,000 British soldiers fell in a single day. They walked into the fire believing the artillery had done its work, only to be met by the untouched German machine guns. It was the deadliest day in the history of the British Army, a trauma that would haunt the nation for a century. Even the animals were not spared. The photos show us the silent partners in this tragedy. Millions of horses, requisitioned from farms across Europe, were dragged into the mud to pull the heavy guns in supply wagons. They died in the millions, their bodies left to rot alongside the men they served. Dogs ran messages through the hail of bullets, and pigeons flew through poison gas to deliver coordinates. The war consumed everything that breathed. When the guns finally fell silent in November of 1918, the silence was deafening. The Western Front had claimed at least 4 million lives. The war to end all wars had finished, but the victory was hollow. The maps had barely changed, but the world had been irrevocably altered. The enthusiastic boys of 1914 were gone. In their place stood a generation of ghosts, men physically broken, blinded by gas, or their minds shattered by shell shock, a term coined to describe the psychological collapse brought on by the relentless bombardment. Looking back at these images now, we do not see the glory that those young men dreamed of on the train platforms. We see the mud. We see the exhaustion etched into the faces of teenagers who had aged a lifetime in a single year. We see the ruins of a civilization that turned its brilliance toward destruction. The Western Front remains a warning from history. It is a testament to the fragility of peace and the monstrous capacity of humanity for violence. These photos are not merely static images of the past. They are the final, silent stare of the fallen, reminding us of the true cost of the scar that tore Europe apart. They ask us to remember not just the victory, but the mud, the wire, and the lost generation buried beneath the poppy fields of France.